You think this is some kind of joke.
It's no laughing matter when justice is due.
Welcome to Whispers of the Past, where forgotten tales return to life. The courtroom was unusually crowded that Tuesday afternoon in Dallas, Texas. It was the kind of day when the air outside simmered in heat, yet inside the courthouse, a strange electricity lingered in the air. Townsfolk had gathered not because of a murder trial or some high-profile case, but because of the man standing at the center of attention, Ethan Cole, a rancher so large and formidable that his very presence seemed to squeeze the space around him. His wrists were shackled in heavy iron cuffs, but even in chains, he looked like a man capable of tearing through them if he so much as decided to. He stood straight, a good head taller than every guard in the room, with broad shoulders that cast a long shadow beneath the overhead lamps. Ethan had been dragged before the judge after months of disputes with landowners and townsfolk. He was known for a temper that burned hot and fast, for brawls that left men bruised, and for a stubborn refusal to pay fines or taxes he claimed were unfair. The authorities finally chained him up after he reportedly damaged half a saloon during a heated fight. People called him a menace. Others whispered that he was a broken man since the loss of his family ranch years ago. Whatever the truth, he was now standing before Judge Raymond Parker, a man not easily rattled, yet even he looked slightly uneasy facing a man of such size and intensity. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as the judge adjusted his spectacles and began reading the case file. "Ethan Cole," he announced, his voice echoing across the hall. "You stand accused of assault, destruction of property, and refusal to pay outstanding debts owed to this county. Do you have anything to say for yourself before sentencing?" Ethan's deep voice carried through the room like thunder. "I've said it before and I'll say it again. Those men had it coming. I don't owe them a dime, and if you all think you can break me with chains, you don't know me." His jaw tightened, his stormy eyes scanning the crowd as though daring anyone to speak against him. The judge sighed. He had seen hardened men before, men who wore rebellion on their sleeves, but there was something about Ethan that made the usual threats and fines seem useless. That was when the unexpected interruption came. A woman's voice, steady though slightly winded, cut through the murmurs. "Your Honor, if I may." Every head turned toward the back of the courtroom. Waddling down the aisle was Martha Simmons, a woman known around town for her wide frame and quiet resilience. She was in her late 30s, her hair pulled back into a bun, her cheeks round and flushed from the heat. Martha was no stranger to whispers and mocking laughter. Her size had made her the subject of ridicule for most of her life, but she had learned to carry herself with dignity. What she lacked in slender beauty, she made up for in a sharp mind and an iron will. The judge raised a brow. "Mrs. Simmons, this isn't your case. What business do you have here?" Martha stopped at the center aisle, folding her hands over her dress. Her voice was firm. "Your Honor, I've heard what's to become of this man. You'll fine him more than he can pay, and he'll rot behind bars until the debt kills his spirit. But I have another solution." A ripple of curiosity spread through the courtroom. Judge Parker leaned forward. "And what would that be?" Martha took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I've been alone a long time. Widowhood left me with nothing but land too small to thrive and nights too quiet to endure. I don't want his money, because he doesn't have any. I want a husband. If this man is going to work off his debts, let him do it by working beside me." The entire courtroom erupted in laughter. Men slapped their knees, women gasped in disbelief, and even the bailiff cracked a grin. It was the most absurd request they had ever heard. Judge Parker himself chuckled, though he tried to compose his expression. "Pick any husband for free, then," he laughed. "This isn't the frontier anymore, Mrs. Simmons. Men aren't handed out like cattle." But Martha did not waver. She turned her gaze toward the towering figure in chains and raised her hand. Her finger, short and stout, pointed directly at Ethan Cole. The laughter died almost instantly. Gasps echoed around the room. Ethan's eyes widened in disbelief. "What the hell is this?" he growled, his voice deep with both anger and shock. He strained against the chains, the cuffs biting into his wrists. Martha didn't blink. "That one?" she said clearly. "If I must have a husband, I'll take the strongest man here. I'll take him." The room fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. The absurd had suddenly become serious. No one had expected her to choose the giant rancher, least of all Ethan himself. Judge Parker cleared his throat, half amused, half stunned. "Mrs. Simmons, are you aware of what you're asking? This man isn't some farmhand to fetch water and chop wood. He's violent, dangerous, and unwilling to bow to anyone." Martha's chin lifted with quiet pride. "Maybe he only needs someone who doesn't bow to anyone either." The silence deepened. Ethan's stormy eyes locked on Martha's steady gaze. For the first time in years, someone looked at him without fear, without mockery, without judgment. He didn't know whether to laugh in her face or snap the chains and storm out. The judge leaned back, rubbing his temple. "Well, this is the damnedest request I've heard in 30 years on this bench. Still, if both parties agree and the law allows, I can't stop it. But Ethan Cole, what do you say?" Ethan's jaw clenched, his muscles tightening beneath the ragged shirt. "You expect me to marry her?" he barked. "To be shackled to some woman I don't even know?" Martha's reply was calm but sharp. "Better shackled to a woman than to a cell." A nervous chuckle rippled through the crowd. Ethan stared at her, then at the judge. His pride screamed to refuse, to spit on the offer and choose prison over humiliation. But deep inside, a small voice whispered of the endless nights in a cell, of wasted years, of a strength with nowhere to go. At least with her, he'd be free under the sky again. The judge's gavel struck once, silencing the room. Then it settled. Papers will be drawn. If the law demands payment through service, then marriage may serve as binding contract. He looked at Martha with a mixture of disbelief and respect. "God help you, Mrs. Simmons. You just picked the most dangerous man in Texas." The crowd erupted again, this time with shouts, gasps, and frantic gossip. Ethan stood rigid, his eyes never leaving Martha's. She, in turn, stood her ground, as though she had been preparing for this moment all her life. As the guards moved to escort Ethan out, one of them whispered, "You really mean to go through with this?" "Ma'am." Martha nodded. "I've lived enough years being laughed at. Let them laugh. They won't laugh for long." And with that, the court adjourned, leaving behind the strangest case Dallas had ever seen. A giant in chains had just been chosen, not for punishment, but for partnership. A woman mocked for her size had stood in front of a crowd and claimed her future boldly. And somewhere in that uneasy union, a story was about to begin, one that would change both their lives forever. The weeks following the court's decision were filled with whispers across Dallas. Every corner store, every saloon, and every church pew carried the story of Martha Simmons and the giant rancher in chains. Some laughed, calling it madness, while others muttered it was a scandal that would end in blood. But for Martha, gossip was nothing new, and she learned long ago to stop letting the opinions of others dictate her choices. What mattered now was that Ethan Cole, the man she had chosen in front of a crowd that mocked her, was no longer rotting in a cell. He was walking free, though his freedom came with a bond he could not escape. The day Ethan arrived at her modest homestead, the silence between them was thick and sharp. The house was a simple wooden structure, weathered by years of storms, standing at the edge of a patch of land too small for a fortune yet too demanding for one woman alone. The fields were half-tilled, the fence broken in spots, and the barn sagged under its own weight. Ethan scanned the property with a critical eye, his jaw tight, his massive hands hanging at his sides like the heavy tools of a laborer. He did not speak as she showed him the rooms, nor when she pointed to the small shed where he might store his belongings. When at last he spoke, his words were clipped. "You've made a mistake." Martha, standing in the kitchen, set down a pot of stew with steady hands. "Maybe. But mistakes are what life is built on. The only question is whether you work with them or let them bury you." Ethan narrowed his eyes at her calm tone. "You think you can tame me? Is that it?" She met his gaze without flinching. "No, I don't want to tame you. I want to live, and I want a partner who knows how to fight for something better than pride. That's all." For days after, Ethan worked in silence. He repaired the broken fence with the skill of a man who had spent his life around cattle and storms. He lifted heavy logs as though they were sticks and patched the barn roof without complaint. Yet the silence was not friendly. It was the silence of a man serving a sentence, his movements mechanical, his eyes distant. At night he sat outside, staring at the horizon, saying nothing while Martha sewed by the fire inside. But Martha was patient. She had seen bitterness before. She had lived with loneliness, and she recognized the signs of a man who carried chains heavier than any iron cuff. She continued with her days as she always had, cooking meals, tending the chickens, and keeping her small farm alive. She never scolded him for his silence, never demanded warmth he was not ready to give. Instead, she let him feel the rhythm of life on the land, steady and unbroken. The first crack in Ethan's walls came one morning when a storm rolled over the plains. The rain fell hard, and the wind tore at the windows. Martha rushed outside to gather laundry she had left on the line, her dress plastered to her skin by the downpour. She struggled against the wind, and one of the heavier sheets twisted around her legs, nearly knocking her to the ground. Before she could fall, Ethan was there. His massive arms caught her, his strength steadying her against the storm. For a brief moment, their eyes met, hers wide with surprise, his burning with something unspoken. He released her quickly, turning back toward the barn. "You'll catch a fever out here," he muttered gruffly. "And you saved me anyway," she replied, her voice soft but steady. That night, he ate 2 bowls of stew instead of 1, and though he said nothing more, Martha noticed the way his shoulders loosened, just slightly, as he sat at the table. In the weeks that followed, the land began to change. With Ethan's labor, the fields grew healthier. He plowed the soil with tireless effort, mended the barn until it stood tall once more, and built new pens for the livestock. The farm, once on the verge of collapse, started to flourish again. Neighbors passing by whispered about the sight of the giant rancher working side by side with the heavyset widow. Some ridiculed, others shook their heads, but a few began to look at Martha with something like respect. Yet the greatest change was not in the land but in Ethan himself. Slowly, almost unwillingly, he began to speak. At first it was only short sentences. "Pass the salt," or "that fence needs fixing." But over time, his words grew into stories, fragments of his past spilling out in quiet moments. He spoke of his family ranch, lost after a fire destroyed half his herd and debt swallowed the rest. He spoke of nights in saloons, drowning grief in whiskey until rage consumed him. He admitted in a low, almost ashamed voice, that he had been on the verge of giving up on life entirely before the judge chained him. Martha listened without interruption. She did not pity him, nor did she scold him for his mistakes. Instead, she responded with simple truths. "You're still here. That means you're not finished yet." Her steady acceptance unsettled him more than mockery ever had. For years, he had been treated as a brute, a wild animal too dangerous to tame. But Martha looked at him as though he were a man capable of more. That look unnerved him, but it also began to carve away at the hardness inside him. One evening, as the sun painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, Ethan found Martha struggling with a heavy water bucket by the well. Without a word, he took it from her hands and carried it inside. She smiled at him, a simple gesture, but it lit something in him he could not explain. "You don't always have to carry the weight alone," he muttered. She looked at him with a warmth that went beyond gratitude. "Neither do you." It was then he realized the truth. She had chosen him not out of desperation but out of courage. In that courtroom, she had pointed at the most dangerous man not because she was foolish, but because she saw something others did not. Months passed, and the bond between them deepened. The nights of silence turned into evenings, filled with quiet conversation, then laughter, then the kind of comfortable companionship neither had known in years. Ethan no longer sat outside alone. Instead, he stayed by the fire, listening to Martha's stories of her childhood, her late husband, her dreams for the future. Slowly, he began to dream again too. The turning point came one evening when townsfolk arrived at the homestead, angry and mocking. A group of men who once fought Ethan at the saloon now taunted Martha, accusing her of chaining herself to a brute. One of them sneered, "He'll break you just like he breaks everything else." Ethan stepped forward, his massive frame towering over them. His fists clenched, rage simmering, but before he could lash out, Martha placed her hand gently on his arm. "Not this time," she whispered. "You don't need to fight to prove anything." Her calm steadied him in a way no chain ever could. He straightened, his voice firm but controlled. "Leave. This is my home, and she is my wife. You'll respect that." The men, unsettled by his restraint, eventually backed away. For the first time in his life, Ethan had won a battle without throwing a punch. That night, as he sat by the fire, he turned to Martha, his voice low but certain. "You didn't free me from the judge's chains. You freed me from myself." Her eyes glistened, and she placed her hand over his. "Then we're even, husband." From that moment on, their marriage was no longer a contract born of desperation or mockery. It became a partnership, forged through labor, respect, and quiet affection. The townsfolk still whispered, but some began to admire the unlikely pair who turned ridicule into strength. Ethan, once a man lost to anger and bitterness, found peace in the steady rhythm of Martha's presence. And Martha, once a woman mocked for her size and loneliness, found love not in a fairy tale, but in the hard work of building a life with a man who finally saw her worth. Years later, people still told the story of the day the judge laughed in court and offered a husband for free. They remembered the gasp when Martha pointed at the giant in chains. What they could never have predicted was how that single, audacious choice would create one of the strongest unions the town had ever seen.